The Dark Nebula had a name in every galactic language, not the same name, but the same meaning, translated through every tongue and every script that had ever developed in this region of space. A meaning that reduced, in every case, to some variation of the same concept. Do not go there. The Keth called it the Void of Silence. The Koran called it the Endless Dark. The Velhari, who were not known for poetry, called it simply the Dead Place, which was less evocative but more accurate. The Vorrkai, who had once sent a fleet of 40 ships into its edges to test its reputation, called it the Consuming, which was what it had done to 31 of those 40 ships before the remaining 9 had retreated and never returned. The Dark Nebula was a region of space approximately 40 light-years across, dense with ionized gas and particulate matter that disrupted every sensor technology any civilization had developed, absorbed energy in ways that made weapons unreliable, and produced navigational interference, severe enough that ships that entered without precise pre-calculated routes had a documented tendency to not come out. It had been there for longer than any current civilization's recorded history, had been avoided for exactly as long. Every major power in the region had, at some point, discussed what might be done about it, whether it could be mapped, whether it could be traversed, whether the resources it might contain could be accessed. Every discussion had reached the same conclusion. The cost of finding out exceeded any plausible benefit. The Dark Nebula was left alone because leaving it alone was the only thing that consistently worked. This had been the consensus for 400 years. Then humanity moved into the systems adjacent to it. Fleet Admiral Teresh of the Keth Dominion had been watching human expansion for 11 years, not with alarm. Humans were not, by the standard metrics the Keth used to assess civilizations, alarming. Modest territorial ambitions, adequate military capability, a diplomatic presence that was active without being aggressive, the kind of neighbor you noted and monitored without devoting significant resources to. What had caught his attention was not what humanity was doing. It was where they were doing it. Over the past 6 years, human settlement had been quietly concentrating in the systems adjacent to the Dark Nebula's edge. Not dramatically, not in ways that looked individually like anything other than normal expansion into available territory. But the pattern, when Teresh's analysts laid it out on a strategic map, showed a consistent tendency. Humans were choosing the systems closest to the nebula when other options were available, systems that every other civilization avoided, specifically because of their proximity to the nebula. Systems where sensor disruption from the nebula's edge made long-range detection unreliable, where the particulate interference complicated weapons systems, where the navigational complexity of the region created approach vectors that were genuinely difficult for any fleet not intimately familiar with local conditions. Systems that were, Teresh's strategic analyst noted in her report, extremely difficult to attack from any direction except through territory humanity already controlled. They are choosing these systems deliberately, his analyst said. I know, Teresh said. The nebula's interference patterns would disrupt any attacking fleet's sensors and weapon systems before they reached engagement range. Any force approaching through these systems without detailed local knowledge would be operating essentially blind. She paused. Sir, they are using the Dark Nebula as a defensive barrier. I know, Teresh said again. Nobody has ever used the Dark Nebula as anything, she said, because nobody has been willing to operate near it long enough to learn its patterns. Teresh looked at the map. At 6 years of human settlement quietly building up along the nebula's edge, at the navigational data that his intelligence services had managed to collect, not enough to understand what humanity was doing inside those systems, but enough to confirm that they were operating there regularly, that their ships moved through the nebula's edge interference with a confidence that suggested familiarity rather than recklessness. How long have they been mapping it? He asked. His analyst checked. Based on the settlement patterns and the navigational confidence we are observing, our best assessment is... She stopped. How long? Teresh repeated. Approximately 40 years, she said quietly, before they settled any of the adjacent systems. They were surveying the nebula for 40 years, before they moved anyone near it. Teresh looked at the map for a long time. The Vorrkai noticed 3 months after Teresh's analysts filed their report. Their response was faster and less analytical than the Keths. The Vorrkai had lost 31 ships to the Dark Nebula 2 centuries ago and had maintained a respectful distance ever since. But the sight of human settlements openly operating in the systems they had always considered unapproachable produced a reaction that their leadership described as strategic concern, and that was, in practice, closer to wounded pride. They sent a fleet, not into the nebula. Nobody sent fleets into the nebula, not after 31 ships, but to the edge of human territory adjacent to it. A show of force. The kind of fleet positioning that communicated, in the universal language of military capability, that the Vorrkai were paying attention and did not appreciate developments they had not been consulted about. The human response to the fleet positioning was a transmission from something called the Nebula Region Administrative Office, delivered by a woman named Director Chen, who had the particular quality of administrative calm that came from people who had been managing complicated logistics for a long time and had developed a relationship with unexpected developments that was steady rather than reactive. Vorrkai Fleet Command, she said. We have noted your positioning. We want to be transparent with you about what we are doing in this region, because we think transparency is better for everyone than the alternative. Can we schedule a briefing? The Vorrkai Fleet Commander, who had prepared for several possible human responses and had not prepared for a briefing offer, agreed. The briefing took place aboard a neutral station and was attended eventually by representatives from 6 civilizations. The Vorrkai and Keth were there first, and word traveled, and within 2 weeks 4 others had requested inclusion, because the Dark Nebula was the kind of thing that every civilization in the region had feelings about, and nobody wanted to be the last to find out what was happening with it. Director Chen presented for 3 hours. What she presented was not, she emphasized at the beginning, classified. It was being shared openly because humanity had decided, after considerable internal discussion, that their position in this region was better served by transparency than by the strategic ambiguity that concealment would provide. The 40-year survey program had begun, she explained, as pure research. The Dark Nebula was the most significant unexplored phenomenon in the region, and humanity had a general institutional tendency toward wanting to understand things that were poorly understood. Initial surveys had been conducted from safe distances, building gradually as techniques improved and familiarity with the nebula's edge patterns increased. What the surveys had found over 40 years was that the Dark Nebula was not uniform. Its interference patterns were consistent in some areas and inconsistent in others. Its density varied in ways that could be mapped and navigated once you understood the underlying structure. Its reputation as an absolute barrier was accurate for ships attempting to traverse it without prior knowledge and inaccurate for ships that had been given detailed charts of its internal structure. The internal structure, 40 years of careful survey work had established, was remarkable. The nebula contained, distributed through its interior, an extensive network of relatively clear corridors, passages where the density dropped enough that navigation was possible, and sensor function was significantly improved. The corridors were not straight. They were not obvious. Finding them had taken decades and significant resources and a willingness to lose survey equipment in the process. But they existed, and they connected, in ways that Chen's presentation mapped carefully, to the systems where humanity had been settling. You have mapped passages through the Dark Nebula, said the Vorrkai Fleet Commander. His voice had a quality that combined disbelief with the slow recognition of something significant. We have mapped significant portions of it, yes, Chen said. We do not have complete coverage. It is a large region and the survey work is ongoing. But we have enough to navigate reliably through the sections relevant to our settlements. She paused. We have also identified what we believe are the primary reasons your fleet lost ships 2 centuries ago. The approach your ships used in that engagement passed through 2 density nodes that produced particularly severe interference. With the benefit of our survey data, those nodes are avoidable. The Vorrkai Fleet Commander was quiet for a long moment. You are telling us why we lost our ships, he said. We thought you would want to know, Chen said. It was a long time ago, but it was a significant loss and the information is relevant. She paused. Also, honestly, we would prefer that you not send another fleet into the Nebula Edge without this information. Because the interference your ships would experience would make the situation harder to manage for everyone. And we are trying to manage this region in a way that works for multiple parties. The strategic implications took several weeks to fully process across the region's various civilizations. What humanity had built, over 40 years of patient survey work and 6 years of careful settlement, was something that no civilization had thought to build in the Dark Nebula's 400-year history as an avoided region, because no civilization had been willing to do the work of understanding it before making use of it. They had built a fortress not in the dramatic sense of walls and weapons, though the settlements had defensive capabilities, in the strategic sense of a position that was extremely difficult to attack, extremely easy to defend, and connected to everything around it, through routes that only the defender knew. Any force attempting to approach humanity's nebula settlements from outside human territory would be operating in the edge interference zones, sensors degraded, weapons unreliable, navigation requiring significant pre-knowledge that no attacking force would possess. Meanwhile, human ships moving through the interior corridors would have full sensor function and navigational confidence. The Dark Nebula, which every civilization had avoided as an obstacle, had become humanity's most significant strategic asset, not through military capability, not through advanced weapons or superior ships, through 40 years of doing something nobody else had been willing to do, treating the most avoided region in the sector as a problem worth understanding rather than a problem worth avoiding. How did you know it would be worth it? Teresh asked Chen in the conversation that followed the formal briefing. 40 years of survey work with no guarantee the data would produce anything useful. Chen thought about the question with the genuine consideration she brought to things she had not been asked before. We did not know it would be worth it, she said. We knew the nebula was poorly understood and that poorly understood things are worth understanding. Whether the understanding would be strategically useful was secondary to the fact that it would be accurate. She paused. We tend to find that accurate understanding of things becomes useful eventually, even when we cannot predict how. The survey program was not designed to produce a fortress. It was designed to understand the nebula. The fortress was what accurate understanding produced. Another pause. That happens fairly often, actually. Teresh thought about 40 years of survey work, about 31 Vorrkai ships and the density nodes that Chen had explained, about 400 years of everyone looking at the Dark Nebula and seeing only what to avoid. You did not see what we saw, he said slowly. We saw the same thing, Chen said. We just decided to look at it more carefully before deciding what it meant. The Dark Nebula was reclassified in the Galactic Council's navigational registry 6 months after the briefing, not as a hazard to avoid, as a complex navigational region requiring specialized knowledge for safe transit, which was accurate, and which acknowledged without stating explicitly that the specialized knowledge existed and that one civilization had it. Teresh's strategic analyst filed an update to her original report. It was shorter than the original. The conclusion was one paragraph. Humanity has spent 40 years doing something no other civilization in this region was willing to do. The result is a strategic position that could not have been achieved through any amount of conventional military investment. The Dark Nebula is not a fortress they built. It is a fortress they found by being willing to look at something everyone else had decided was not worth looking at. I do not have a strategic framework for this. I am recommending that we develop one, because I believe this is not the only time humanity will find something in a place nobody else was looking. The recommendation was approved. Nobody developed the framework, not because it was not needed, but because every time they tried, they found that the framework kept requiring them to answer a prior question. Not what humanity would do, but why humanity kept finding things in places everyone else had decided were not worth examining. The answer, when they looked for it, was simpler than they expected. Humanity had a word for it. Several words in several languages that translated roughly to the same thing. The belief that the places that seemed most difficult, most dangerous, most not worth the trouble, were frequently the places most worth understanding, because those were the places nobody else had looked.